Welcome to a journey into the forgotten corners of American history, where legends are born from whispered fears and truth becomes stranger than any fiction ever conceived. Today, we venture into the mist-shrouded hills of Missouri to uncover a tale so unsettling that entire communities chose to forget it rather than face its implications. This is the story of the Callahan Mansion, a place where the boundaries between the living and the dead became dangerously thin, where a family's ambition unleashed forces that would terrorize the Ozark hills for generations. What began as a symbol of prosperity and progress would become a monument to humanity's darkest obsessions, a place where the very fabric of reality seemed to unravel. Before we descend into this labyrinth of mystery and dread, understand that what you're about to hear challenges everything we think we know about the early days of the American frontier. The official records speak of progress and civilization, but they remain silent about the shadows that followed in their wake, the prices paid for prosperity that were too terrible to acknowledge. The year was 1821, and Missouri had just achieved statehood, transforming from a wild territory into a legitimate part of the growing American nation. It was a time of unprecedented opportunity, when fortunes could be made by those bold enough to venture into the untamed wilderness and claim their piece of the expanding frontier. Among these ambitious pioneers was Cornelius Callahan, a man whose vision extended far beyond the modest homesteads and trading posts that dotted the Missouri landscape. Callahan had arrived from Boston with considerable wealth, connections to powerful Eastern families, and plans that would reshape the very character of the region he had chosen to call home. Callahan was not like the typical frontier settlers who sought only land and basic prosperity. He was a man of education and refinement, someone who had studied architecture in Europe and possessed an understanding of engineering principles that was decades ahead of his time. More importantly, he harbored beliefs about the nature of existence that placed him at odds with the conventional religious and philosophical thinking of his era. The location Callahan chose for his grand estate was itself a source of unease among the local population. The site sat atop a series of natural limestone caves that the indigenous peoples of the region had long considered sacred and, more troubling, dangerous. The local tribes spoke in hushed tones of the place they called the Breathing Hills, where the earth itself seemed to exhale strange vapors, and where those who ventured too deep into the cave systems were sometimes found days later, alive but fundamentally changed. The tribal elders warned Callahan against building on the site, telling him through interpreters that the caves were home to spirits that should not be disturbed, entities that existed in the spaces between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. These warnings were dismissed by Callahan as primitive superstition, the fearful imaginings of people who lacked the scientific understanding to explain natural phenomena. Construction of the Callahan Mansion began in the spring of 1822, and from the very beginning, the project was marked by incidents that would have given a more superstitious man pause. Workers reported tools that moved on their own, strange sounds echoing from the cave systems beneath the construction site, and an unsettling feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. More disturbing were the accidents that plagued the construction. Men fell from scaffolding that had been properly secured. Tools broke in ways that defied explanation. Several workers simply disappeared during their shifts, vanishing without a trace, despite the isolated nature of the construction site that should have made such disappearances impossible. The local population began to whisper that Callahan's project was cursed, that his refusal to heed the tribal warnings had awakened something that should have remained dormant. But Callahan pressed forward with his plans, driven by a vision that seemed to grow more elaborate and mysterious with each passing month. The mansion that emerged from this troubled construction was unlike anything that had ever been built in the Missouri Territory. Rising 4 stories from the hillside, it was a Gothic masterpiece that seemed to have been transplanted from the darkest corners of European imagination. Its towers and turrets reached toward the sky like grasping fingers, while its windows stared out over the surrounding landscape with an almost sentient awareness. But it was the mansion's interior that truly set it apart from any conventional dwelling. Callahan had incorporated elements into the design that served no apparent practical purpose, architectural features that seemed to follow some hidden logic that only he understood. Corridors that led nowhere, rooms with no apparent function, and most unsettling of all, a series of chambers built directly into the cave system beneath the house. The basement levels of the mansion extended deep into the limestone caves, creating a subterranean complex that seemed to go on forever. Callahan claimed these chambers were for storage and wine cellars, but the workers who had built them reported features that suggested a very different purpose. There were rooms lined with mirrors, chambers with acoustic properties that amplified whispers into thunderous echoes, and spaces where the very air seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly energy. When the mansion was finally completed in the autumn of 1824, Callahan moved in with his wife, Margaret, and their 3 children. Margaret Callahan was a woman of delicate constitution who had never fully recovered from the birth of their youngest child, and the isolation of their new home seemed to weigh heavily upon her spirits. The Callahan children, 2 boys and a girl ranging in age from 6 to 12, initially seemed to thrive in their new environment. They explored the vast mansion with the boundless energy of youth, turning its many rooms and corridors into their personal playground. But as the weeks passed, their behavior began to change in ways that alarmed the household staff. The children started speaking of new friends they had made, invisible companions who lived in the walls and came out to play when the adults weren't watching. They would have long conversations with empty air, laughing and responding to voices that no one else could hear. When questioned about these imaginary friends, the children would become evasive, insisting that their companions were real and that the adults simply couldn't see them because they weren't special enough. Margaret Callahan was the first to experience what would later be described as the mansion's more disturbing phenomena. She began reporting strange dreams in which she found herself walking through corridors that didn't exist in the waking world, rooms that seemed to shift and change when she wasn't looking directly at them. In these dreams, she encountered figures from her past, people who had died years before, who spoke to her with urgent intensity about matters she couldn't quite remember upon waking. More troubling were the occasions when Margaret would wake to find herself in parts of the mansion that she had no memory of visiting, sometimes in the basement chambers that Cornelius had forbidden the family from entering. She would be discovered by servants, standing motionless in the darkness, staring at walls that seemed to hold some significance that she couldn't explain. Cornelius himself seemed unaffected by the strange atmosphere that was beginning to permeate the mansion. If anything, he appeared energized by their new environment, spending long hours in his private study, working on projects that he refused to discuss with anyone, including his wife. The servants reported seeing lights burning in his study well into the early hours of the morning, and sometimes strange odors would drift from beneath his door, scents that reminded them of burning herbs and something else they couldn't identify. The first clear indication that something was seriously wrong came during the winter of 1825, when the youngest Callahan child, 6-year-old Emily, was found by a servant standing in the mansion's main hallway in the middle of the night. The child was sleepwalking, which was not unusual in itself, but she was carrying on a detailed conversation with someone who wasn't there, speaking in a voice that was not her own. The servant who discovered Emily reported that the child was speaking in what sounded like an adult woman's voice, discussing matters that no 6-year-old could possibly understand. She was talking about events that had happened before she was born, people she had never met and places she had never been. When the servant attempted to wake her, Emily turned toward her with eyes that seemed to look right through her, and for a moment the servant swore she saw the face of a stranger looking back at her. This incident marked the beginning of a pattern of increasingly disturbing behavior among all the Callahan children. They would be found in various parts of the mansion at all hours, sometimes alone, sometimes together, always engaged in activities that seemed far beyond their years. They would speak of things they couldn't possibly know, demonstrate knowledge of subjects they had never studied, and display personality traits that were completely foreign to their normal characters. Margaret Callahan's condition also continued to deteriorate. She began experiencing periods where she would lose hours or even entire days, with no memory of what had transpired during these gaps. The servants would find her in different clothes than she had been wearing, sometimes with her hair arranged in styles she had never worn before, occasionally with small injuries that she couldn't explain. During her lucid moments, Margaret would speak fearfully of the presence she felt throughout the mansion, entities that seemed to be growing stronger and more bold with each passing day. She described feeling watched constantly, of hearing whispers in rooms that should have been empty, of seeing movement in her peripheral vision that vanished when she turned to look directly. The servants began to report their own experiences with the mansion's inexplicable phenomena. Doors would open and close on their own, often in sequence, as if someone was walking through the house. Footsteps could be heard in the corridors above when everyone was accounted for on the ground floor. Most unsettling of all, several servants reported encountering people in the mansion who they didn't recognize, figures who would disappear when approached or questioned. These mysterious figures were described as being dressed in clothing from different time periods, some in styles that were decades out of date, others in garments that seemed to belong to future fashions that hadn't yet been invented. They would appear in doorways, standing at the ends of corridors or sitting in chairs in rooms that had been empty moments before. When servants attempted to approach these figures, they would simply fade away, leaving behind only a lingering sense of sadness and an inexplicable drop in temperature. Cornelius Callahan's response to these reports was dismissive and increasingly irritated. He insisted that the servants were allowing their imaginations to run wild, that the isolation of the mansion and the influence of local superstitions were causing them to misinterpret perfectly natural phenomena. He forbade the staff from discussing these incidents among themselves and threatened to dismiss anyone who continued to spread what he called foolish stories. But Cornelius's own behavior was becoming increasingly erratic. He had begun spending almost all of his time in the basement chambers, emerging only for meals and brief interactions with his family. When he did appear, he seemed distracted and distant, as if his attention was focused on matters that existed beyond the physical world around him. The servants reported strange deliveries arriving at the mansion during the night, packages and crates that Cornelius would personally carry down to the basement chambers. No one was allowed to see the contents of these deliveries, and Cornelius would become violently angry if questioned about them. The few glimpses that servants caught suggested that the packages contained books, instruments, and materials that seemed to have no connection to any normal household needs. Local residents began to notice changes in the Callahan family during their infrequent visits to the nearby settlement of Millbrook. The children, who had once been outgoing and cheerful, now seemed withdrawn and strangely mature. They would stare at people with an intensity that was unsettling in one so young, and they would sometimes make comments that suggested knowledge of private matters that they couldn't possibly have learned through normal means. Margaret Callahan's appearances in town became increasingly rare, and when she did venture out, she seemed like a shadow of her former self. She had lost a considerable amount of weight, her complexion had taken on a pale, almost translucent quality, and she moved with the uncertain gait of someone who was not entirely sure of their surroundings. The local physician, Dr. Samuel Morrison, was called to examine Margaret during one of her more severe episodes in the spring of 1826. Dr. Morrison was a practical man who had little patience for superstition, but his examination of Margaret left him deeply troubled. Her physical symptoms defied any medical explanation he could provide, and her mental state seemed to fluctuate between periods of clarity and episodes where she appeared to be responding to stimuli that weren't present. Most disturbing to Dr. Morrison was Margaret's insistence that she was not alone in her body, that she shared her physical form with other consciousnesses that would sometimes take control of her actions. During these episodes, her voice would change, her mannerisms would alter completely, and she would demonstrate knowledge and abilities that were foreign to her normal personality. Dr. Morrison's attempts to discuss Margaret's condition with Cornelius were met with hostility and denial. Cornelius insisted that his wife was simply suffering from nervous exhaustion brought on by the isolation of their new home, and he refused to consider any treatment that would require her to leave the mansion. When Dr. Morrison suggested that the entire family might benefit from a temporary relocation to a more populated area, Cornelius became enraged and ordered him to leave the property immediately. The isolation of the Callahan family became complete during the summer of 1826, when Cornelius dismissed the last of the household servants and announced that the family would be managing their own affairs from that point forward. The dismissed servants were sworn to secrecy about their experiences at the mansion, and each was given a substantial sum of money, along with the understanding that their continued well-being depended on their discretion. But secrets have a way of emerging, despite the best efforts to contain them, and the stories told by the former Callahan servants began to spread throughout the local community. These accounts painted a picture of a household that had fallen under the influence of forces that existed beyond normal human understanding, a family that had become prisoners in their own home. The servants spoke of rooms in the mansion that seemed to exist in a state of constant twilight, regardless of the time of day or the amount of sunlight streaming through the windows. They described corridors that seemed to stretch longer than should have been physically possible, and staircases that sometimes led to floors that hadn't been there the day before. Most unsettling were the accounts of the basement chambers, which the servants described as a labyrinth of interconnected rooms that seemed to extend far beyond the foundations of the mansion itself. They spoke of chambers filled with mirrors that reflected images of people who weren't present, rooms where the walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, and spaces where the very air seemed to whisper secrets in languages that predated human civilization. The former servants also reported that Cornelius had been conducting some kind of experiments or rituals in these basement chambers, activities that involved the use of strange instruments and the recitation of words in languages that none of them recognized. They described seeing lights emanating from these chambers that had no apparent source, and hearing sounds that seemed to come from impossible distances, as if the basement somehow connected to vast spaces that existed far beyond the physical boundaries of the mansion. As word of these stories spread, the local community began to give the Callahan mansion a wide berth. Travelers who had once used the road that passed near the property began taking longer routes to avoid the area. Local hunters and trappers reported that animals seemed to avoid the vicinity of the mansion, and that the normal sounds of wildlife fell silent when one approached too closely to the property. The few brave souls who ventured close enough to observe the mansion reported seeing lights moving through its windows at all hours of the night, shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source, and occasionally figures standing at the windows who would vanish when looked at directly. Some claimed to have heard music drifting from the mansion, melodies that seemed to come from no earthly instrument, and that left listeners with a profound sense of melancholy and unease. During the autumn of 1826, a traveling minister named Reverend Joshua Blackwood arrived in Millbrook and learned of the situation at the Callahan mansion. Reverend Blackwood was a man of strong faith who had made it his mission to confront what he believed to be manifestations of evil wherever he encountered them. Despite warnings from the local residents, he decided to visit the mansion and offer his assistance to the Callahan family. Reverend Blackwood's visit to the mansion was brief and deeply disturbing. He was received by Cornelius Callahan, who appeared to be in a state of barely controlled agitation. The minister reported that Cornelius seemed to be carrying on conversations with people who weren't present, responding to voices that only he could hear. The mansion itself felt oppressive and wrong, filled with an atmosphere of dread that seemed to press down upon anyone who entered. The minister's attempts to speak with Margaret and the children were unsuccessful. Margaret appeared to be in a trance-like state, unresponsive to his presence, and seemingly unaware of her surroundings. The children, when they appeared at all, seemed to be observing him with an intelligence that was far too mature for their ages, and they spoke in whispers among themselves, in what sounded like a language he had never heard before. Most disturbing of all was Reverend Blackwood's brief glimpse into the basement chambers. Cornelius had reluctantly allowed him to see a small portion of the underground complex, and what the minister observed there convinced him that forces of genuine evil had taken residence in the mansion. He described rooms filled with symbols and diagrams that seemed to hurt the eyes to look upon, mirrors that reflected images of places that couldn't possibly exist, and an overwhelming sense that he was standing at the threshold of realms that were never meant to be accessed by human beings. Reverend Blackwood fled the mansion that same day, and his subsequent reports to church authorities in St. Louis painted a picture of a situation that was beyond the scope of conventional religious intervention. He recommended that the mansion be avoided entirely, and that prayers be offered for the souls of the Callahan family, though he privately believed that it might already be too late to save them. The winter of 1826 to 1827 was particularly harsh in the Missouri Territory, with heavy snows that isolated the Callahan mansion even more completely than usual. No one from the outside world had any contact with the family during this period, and when spring finally arrived, the silence from the mansion had taken on an ominous quality that filled the local community with dread. It was a traveling merchant named William Hayes who first discovered that something had gone terribly wrong at the Callahan mansion. Hayes had been making his regular rounds through the territory when he decided to stop at the mansion to see if the family needed any supplies. What he found there would haunt him for the rest of his life. The mansion appeared to be completely abandoned. The windows were dark, the grounds were overgrown, and there was no sign of life anywhere on the property. But when Hayes approached the front door, he found it standing wide open, as if the occupants had simply walked out and never returned. The interior of the mansion was in a state of eerie preservation, with furniture and personal belongings exactly as they had been left, but covered with a fine layer of dust that suggested no one had been present for months. Hayes's search of the mansion revealed no trace of the Callahan family. Their clothes were still in their wardrobes, their personal effects remained in their proper places, and there was no evidence of any struggle or hasty departure. It was as if the family had simply vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the empty shell of their once grand home. The basement chambers presented an even more disturbing mystery. Hayes found these rooms filled with strange apparatus and materials that he couldn't identify, along with books and documents written in languages he didn't recognize. The walls were covered with diagrams and symbols that seemed to shift and change when he wasn't looking directly at them, and the very air in these chambers felt thick and oppressive, as if it were charged with some kind of invisible energy. Most unsettling of all was a large circular chamber at the very heart of the basement complex, a room that seemed to serve as the focal point for whatever activities Cornelius had been conducting. The floor of this chamber was covered with intricate patterns carved directly into the stone, patterns that seemed to draw the eye inward toward a central point where the stone appeared to be darker and smoother than the surrounding area. Hayes reported that standing in this chamber produced a profound sense of vertigo and disorientation, as if the normal laws of physics didn't quite apply in that space. He described feeling as though he were standing at the edge of a vast abyss, even though the floor appeared to be solid stone. The sensation was so overwhelming that he was forced to leave the chamber quickly, and he never returned to that part of the mansion. The disappearance of the Callahan family became the subject of extensive investigation by territorial authorities, but no trace of them was ever found. Search parties combed the surrounding wilderness. The cave systems beneath the mansion were explored as thoroughly as possible, and inquiries were made throughout the territory and beyond. It was as if the family had simply ceased to exist, leaving behind only questions and a growing sense of unease about what might have happened to them. The official investigation concluded that the family had likely fallen victim to some kind of accident or natural disaster, possibly becoming lost in the extensive cave systems beneath their property. But this explanation satisfied no one who was familiar with the strange events that had preceded their disappearance, and local residents remained convinced that something far more sinister had occurred. In the months following the discovery of the empty mansion, several attempts were made to settle the property or put it to some productive use. But these efforts were consistently thwarted by incidents that defied rational explanation. Potential buyers would arrive to inspect the property and leave within hours, often in a state of visible distress. Workers hired to maintain the grounds would refuse to return after their first day on the job. Even livestock brought to graze on the property would become agitated and refuse to remain in the area. The mansion itself seemed to resist all attempts at occupation or renovation. Tools would disappear or break without explanation. Materials would be found moved from where they had been left, often arranged in patterns that served no apparent purpose. Workers reported feeling constantly watched, and would sometimes catch glimpses of figures moving through the mansion's windows, even though the building was supposed to be empty. Most disturbing were the sounds that began to emanate from the mansion during the night hours. Local residents reported hearing music, voices, and other sounds that suggested the building was occupied, even though investigations during daylight hours always revealed it to be empty. These sounds were described as being both beautiful and deeply unsettling, melodies that seemed to come from another world, and voices that spoke in languages that predated human civilization. As the years passed, the Callahan mansion acquired a reputation as a place to be avoided at all costs. Local folklore began to develop around the property, stories that attempted to explain the strange phenomena that continued to manifest there. Some believed that the mansion was haunted by the spirits of the Callahan family, trapped in their former home by the mysterious circumstances of their disappearance. Others suggested that Cornelius's experiments had opened doorways to other realms, allowing entities from beyond our world to enter and take residence in the mansion. The most persistent legend was that the mansion existed in a state of temporal flux, that time itself moved differently within its walls. According to this theory, the Callahan family hadn't disappeared at all, but had become trapped in a different time stream, doomed to repeat their final days over and over again for eternity. Supporters of this theory pointed to the reports of lights and sounds from the mansion, suggesting that these were glimpses of the family continuing their existence in a parallel temporal dimension. During the 1830s, a series of scientific expeditions attempted to study the phenomena associated with the Callahan mansion. These expeditions were organized by universities and scientific societies from the eastern states, and they brought with them the latest instruments and methodologies for investigating unexplained phenomena. But these scientific approaches proved to be no more successful than the earlier attempts to understand what had happened at the mansion. The scientific expeditions documented numerous anomalies that defied conventional explanation. Magnetic compasses would spin wildly when brought near certain areas of the mansion. Temperature measurements revealed pockets of extreme cold and heat that had no apparent source. Photographic equipment would malfunction in specific rooms, producing images that showed figures and objects that weren't visible to the naked eye. Most significantly, several expedition members reported experiencing temporal dislocations while inside the mansion. They would enter a room and emerge hours later, convinced that only minutes had passed. Others reported the opposite experience, feeling as though they had spent hours exploring the mansion, only to discover that mere minutes had elapsed in the outside world. These temporal anomalies were consistent enough to be documented, but they remained completely inexplicable using the scientific knowledge of the time. The basement chambers continued to be a particular focus of scientific interest, but they also proved to be the most dangerous area of the mansion for investigators. Several expedition members reported experiencing vivid hallucinations while in these chambers, visions of people and events that seemed completely real but couldn't possibly be occurring. Others described feeling as though they were being pulled or drawn toward specific areas of the basement, as if some invisible force were attempting to guide their movements. One particularly disturbing incident occurred during an 1834 expedition when a researcher named Professor Edmund Hartley became separated from his colleagues while exploring the basement chambers. When his absence was discovered several hours later, a search was immediately organized. Hartley was found in the circular chamber at the heart of the basement complex, standing motionless in the center of the carved patterns on the floor. Hartley appeared to be in a trance-like state, unresponsive to his colleagues' attempts to rouse him. When they finally managed to lead him from the chamber, he seemed disoriented and confused. With no memory of how he had gotten there, or how long he had been standing in that position. More troubling, Hartley's hair had turned completely white during his time in the chamber, and he spoke of having experienced visions of vast spaces and entities that existed beyond human comprehension. Professor Hartley's experience marked the end of organized scientific expeditions to the Callahan mansion. The academic community concluded that the risks associated with studying the property were too great to justify continued investigation, and official interest in the mansion's phenomena gradually waned. But the stories and legends continued to grow, fed by the occasional reports of travelers and local residents who claimed to have witnessed new manifestations of the mansion's mysterious properties. During the 1840s, the area around the Callahan mansion began to experience what local residents described as a spreading influence. Properties adjacent to the mansion started to exhibit their own unexplained phenomena, though these were generally less intense than what was observed at the mansion itself. Neighbors reported strange dreams, unexplained sounds, and occasional sightings of figures that seemed to be connected to the mansion's mysterious occupants. The cave systems beneath the mansion also became a source of ongoing concern. Explorers who ventured into these caves reported that they seemed to extend much farther than should have been physically possible, connecting to chambers and passages that didn't appear on any geological surveys. Some claimed to have discovered evidence of human habitation in these deep chambers, including artifacts and structures that seemed to predate any known settlement in the area. Most disturbing were the reports of voices echoing through the cave systems, sounds that seemed to come from impossible distances and that spoke in languages that no one could identify. These voices were described as being both beautiful and terrifying, conveying emotions and concepts that were beyond normal human experience. Some listeners claimed that the voices were attempting to communicate specific information, but the meaning remained frustratingly elusive. The phenomenon of the spreading influence became more pronounced as the decades passed. Families living within a 5-mile radius of the mansion began reporting experiences that mirrored those originally associated with the Callahan property itself. Children would speak of invisible friends who seemed to know things they shouldn't. Adults would experience periods of lost time and find themselves in locations they didn't remember visiting. Livestock would behave strangely, often refusing to graze in certain areas or becoming agitated for no apparent reason. Local clergy attempted to address these concerns through prayer services and blessings, but their efforts seemed to have little effect on the phenomena. Some ministers reported feeling an oppressive presence during their visits to affected properties, and several refused to return after their initial encounters with the spreading influence. The situation became so concerning that the regional bishop issued a formal statement advising clergy to avoid the area entirely unless absolutely necessary. The Civil War years brought a temporary respite from the legends surrounding the Callahan mansion, as the attention of the local population was focused on more immediate concerns. But even during this period of national crisis, the mansion continued to exert its mysterious influence on the surrounding area. Several Union and Confederate units that passed through the region reported strange experiences near the property, including sightings of figures in period dress who would appear and disappear without explanation. One particularly well-documented incident occurred in 1863, when a Union cavalry unit made camp near the mansion during a scouting mission. The soldiers reported being awakened during the night by the sound of a grand ball taking place inside the mansion, complete with orchestra music and the voices of dozens of guests. When officers investigated, they found the mansion dark and empty, but the sounds continued throughout the night, clearly audible to the entire unit. The commanding officer, Colonel Marcus Thompson, included a detailed account of this incident in his official report, noting that the experience had a profound effect on the morale of his men. Several soldiers requested transfers to other units rather than remain in the area, and those who stayed reported ongoing nightmares and feelings of unease that persisted long after they had left the region. A Confederate patrol had a similar experience several months later, reporting that they had observed what appeared to be a formal dinner party taking place in the mansion's dining room, complete with elegantly dressed guests and servants moving about with silver trays. The patrol's leader, Captain James Whitmore, attempted to approach the mansion to investigate, but as he drew closer, the figures became translucent and eventually disappeared entirely, leaving only empty rooms visible through the windows. These military encounters added a new dimension to the mansion's legend, suggesting that its phenomena were not limited to isolated incidents, but could manifest on a scale large enough to affect entire military units. The reports from both Union and Confederate forces were remarkably consistent, describing elaborate social gatherings that seemed to be taking place in a different time period, with participants dressed in fashions that predated the Civil War era. Following the end of the Civil War, interest in the Callahan mansion experienced a revival as the nation began to focus once again on domestic mysteries and unexplained phenomena. The late 19th century was a period of growing interest in spiritualism and the supernatural, and the mansion became a destination for mediums, psychic investigators, and others who claimed to possess special abilities for communicating with the spirit world. These spiritualist investigations produced a wealth of claims and theories about the nature of the phenomena at the mansion, but they also added new layers of mystery to an already complex situation. Different mediums reported receiving contradictory messages from entities claiming to be the Callahan family, and the information provided through these supposed communications often conflicted with known historical facts about the family's life and disappearance. Some mediums claimed that the Callahan family was trapped in the mansion by their own experiments with forces beyond human understanding, doomed to repeat their final days until they could find a way to undo what they had done. Others suggested that the family had successfully transcended physical existence and now existed as pure consciousness within the mansion's walls, occasionally manifesting to communicate with the living world. The most disturbing theory proposed by the spiritualist investigators was that the mansion had become a kind of dimensional nexus, a place where multiple realities intersected and where the normal boundaries between different planes of existence had been permanently weakened. According to this theory, the phenomena observed at the mansion were not manifestations of the Callahan family at all, but rather glimpses of other worlds and other times that were bleeding through into our reality. One particularly influential medium, a woman named Madame Evangeline Rousseau, claimed to have made contact with Cornelius Callahan himself during a séance conducted in the mansion's main parlor. According to Madame Rousseau, Cornelius had revealed that his experiments had been successful beyond his wildest dreams, but that success had come at a terrible price. He had discovered a way to transcend the limitations of linear time and physical space, but in doing so, he had trapped his family in a state of existence that was neither fully alive nor completely dead. Madame Rousseau's account suggested that the Callahan family existed in a kind of temporal loop, reliving the same period of their lives over and over again, aware of their situation but powerless to change it. According to this theory, the phenomena observed at the mansion were the result of this temporal loop occasionally intersecting with normal reality, allowing observers to catch glimpses of the family's endless repetition of their final days. Other spiritualist investigators reported making contact with entities that claimed to be previous visitors to the mansion, who had become trapped in the same temporal anomaly that held the Callahan family. These entities spoke of a growing population of souls who had been drawn into the mansion's influence over the decades, creating a kind of supernatural community that existed parallel to the normal world, but remained largely invisible to living observers. As the 19th century drew to a close, the Callahan mansion had become firmly established in regional folklore as a place of mystery and supernatural activity. The property remained officially abandoned, but it continued to attract visitors from across the country who were drawn by the stories of its unexplained phenomena. Most of these visitors left with their own tales to tell, adding to the growing body of legend that surrounded the mansion. The turn of the 20th century brought new attempts to understand the mansion's mysteries using the latest scientific methods and technologies. Investigators armed with early photographic equipment, electromagnetic detection devices, and other modern instruments documented numerous anomalies that seemed to confirm the existence of genuine supernatural phenomena at the property. Photographs taken inside the mansion frequently showed figures and objects that weren't visible to the naked eye, including what appeared to be members of the Callahan family going about their daily routines as if they were still alive. These photographic anomalies were consistent across different cameras and photographers, suggesting that they represented genuine phenomena rather than equipment malfunctions or deliberate hoaxes. Electromagnetic measurements revealed unusual energy patterns throughout the mansion, with particularly strong readings in the basement chambers where Cornelius had conducted his mysterious experiments. These energy patterns seemed to fluctuate in regular cycles, as if they were responding to some kind of external influence or following a predetermined pattern. Most intriguingly, early audio recording equipment captured sounds and voices that weren't audible during the actual recording sessions. When these recordings were played back, investigators could clearly hear conversations, music, and other sounds that suggested the mansion was occupied by invisible residents. Analysis of these recordings revealed that many of the voices spoke in archaic forms of English and other languages, consistent with the time period when the Callahan family had lived in the mansion. The early 20th century also saw the first serious attempts to document the complete history of the Callahan family and their mysterious disappearance. Researchers combed through historical records, interviewed elderly residents who remembered the family, and attempted to piece together a comprehensive account of the events that had led to the mansion's reputation as a supernatural hotspot. These historical investigations revealed that Cornelius Callahan had been involved in activities that went far beyond the conventional pursuits of a wealthy frontier settler. Records from Eastern universities showed that he had corresponded with researchers and theorists who were exploring the boundaries between science and the supernatural, individuals who believed that the natural world contained forces and dimensions that were not yet understood by conventional science. Cornelius's personal library, which had been left behind in the mansion, contained books and documents that dealt with subjects ranging from ancient mysticism to cutting-edge theoretical physics. Many of these works were written in languages that required specialized knowledge to translate, and they dealt with concepts that were decades ahead of their time. The collection suggested that Cornelius had been attempting to synthesize knowledge from multiple disciplines in pursuit of some grand theoretical framework that would explain the fundamental nature of reality itself. The historical research also revealed that the cave systems beneath the mansion had been known to indigenous peoples for centuries before Cornelius's arrival, and that these caves had played a significant role in tribal spiritual practices. The caves were believed to be portals to the spirit world, places where the boundary between the physical and spiritual realms was naturally thin. The tribal warnings that Cornelius had dismissed as superstition were actually based on generations of experience with the unusual properties of the site. Archaeological excavations in the cave systems during the early 1900s uncovered evidence that supported the indigenous accounts of the site's spiritual significance. Researchers discovered ancient petroglyphs that depicted figures moving between different realms of existence, as well as artifacts that suggested the caves had been used for ceremonial purposes for thousands of years. Most intriguingly, some of the symbols found in the caves bore a striking resemblance to the diagrams that Cornelius had carved into the floors and walls of his basement chambers. As the 20th century progressed, the Callahan mansion continued to attract attention from researchers, thrill seekers, and those who were simply curious about its legendary phenomena. The property changed hands several times, but no owner was ever able to successfully develop or inhabit it. Each attempt to restore the mansion or put it to practical use was abandoned after a short time, usually following incidents that convinced the new owners that the property was genuinely haunted. During the 1920s, a wealthy industrialist named Harrison Blackwood purchased the mansion with the intention of converting it into a luxury hotel that would capitalize on its supernatural reputation. Blackwood invested substantial resources in renovating the property, hiring teams of workers to restore the mansion to its original grandeur while adding modern amenities that would attract wealthy guests seeking a unique experience. The renovation project proceeded smoothly during the initial phases, but as work progressed into the basement chambers, the construction crews began to experience the same kinds of phenomena that had plagued previous attempts to work on the property. Tools would disappear or be found in impossible locations. Workers would report feeling watched and would sometimes catch glimpses of figures observing them from the shadows. Most disturbing of all, several workers claimed to have encountered members of the Callahan family who appeared as solid and real as living people, but would vanish when approached. The renovation project was finally abandoned when a worker named Thomas Mitchell disappeared while working alone in the basement chambers. Mitchell had been installing electrical wiring in the circular chamber at the heart of the basement complex when his colleagues lost contact with him. A search of the chamber revealed no trace of Mitchell, despite the fact that there was only one entrance and exit, which had been under constant observation. Mitchell was never found, and his disappearance convinced Blackwood that the mansion was too dangerous to be used for commercial purposes. The property was once again abandoned, and Blackwood sold it at a substantial loss to a local historical society that promised to maintain it as a historical landmark while keeping it closed to the general public. The Great Depression and World War II brought a temporary decline in interest in the Callahan mansion, as the nation's attention was focused on more pressing concerns. But the mansion's reputation continued to grow through word of mouth and occasional newspaper articles that recounted its mysterious history. Local residents continued to report strange phenomena associated with the property, including lights in the windows, sounds of occupation, and sightings of figures that appeared to be the Callahan family. During the 1950s, the emergence of television and mass media brought renewed attention to the mansion as part of a growing national fascination with supernatural phenomena. Television crews visited the property to film documentaries about its history, and these broadcasts introduced the legend of the Callahan mansion to a national audience. The television investigations documented many of the same phenomena that had been reported for over a century, including unexplained sounds, temperature fluctuations, and electromagnetic anomalies. But they also captured new evidence that suggested the mansion's supernatural activity was actually increasing over time rather than diminishing. Cameras recorded figures moving through the mansion's rooms, voices speaking in empty chambers, and objects moving without any apparent cause. Most significantly, the television investigations revealed that the phenomena at the mansion seemed to respond to the presence of observers. The supernatural activity would often intensify when investigators were present, as if the mansion's invisible residents were attempting to communicate with the living world. This interactive quality suggested that whatever forces were at work in the mansion possessed some form of consciousness and intentionality. The 1960s and 1970s brought a new generation of researchers to the mansion, individuals who approached its mysteries with more sophisticated equipment and methodologies than had been available to earlier investigators. These modern researchers used advanced recording equipment, computer analysis, and scientific instruments that could detect phenomena that would have been invisible to previous generations of investigators. The results of these modern investigations were both fascinating and disturbing. Computer analysis of audio recordings revealed complex patterns in the sounds emanating from the mansion, patterns that suggested some form of structured communication rather than random supernatural noise. Electromagnetic measurements showed that the mansion existed in a state of constant energy flux, with readings that varied according to cycles that seemed to correspond to astronomical events and seasonal changes. Most intriguingly, some researchers reported experiencing what they described as temporal displacement while inside the mansion. They would enter the building in the present day, but would experience events and encounter people from the mansion's past, as if they had somehow been transported back in time to witness the Callahan family's final days. These experiences were so vivid and detailed that they provided new information about the family's life and the circumstances of their disappearance. One particularly significant incident occurred in 1973, when a researcher named Dr. Sarah Whitman experienced what she described as a complete temporal displacement while exploring the mansion's basement chambers. Dr. Whitman reported finding herself in the mansion as it had existed in 1826, complete with period furnishings and decorations. She encountered Cornelius Callahan in his study, where he was working on experiments that seemed to involve manipulating the fundamental structure of space and time. According to Dr. Whitman's account, Cornelius was attempting to create what he called temporal windows, openings that would allow him to observe and interact with other time periods. His experiments had been successful beyond his wildest expectations, but they had also had unintended consequences that he was struggling to control. The mansion had become unstuck in time, existing simultaneously in multiple temporal dimensions and allowing past, present, and future to overlap in ways that defied conventional understanding. Dr. Whitman's experience lasted for what felt like several hours, during which she observed the Callahan family going about their daily routines while being increasingly affected by the temporal distortions that Cornelius's experiments had created. She watched as the family members began to experience episodes where they would slip between different time periods, sometimes encountering versions of themselves from different temporal dimensions. The experience ended abruptly when Dr. Whitman found herself back in the present-day mansion, with no clear memory of how the transition had occurred. But her detailed account of what she had observed provided new insights into the nature of the phenomena at the mansion and suggested that the Callahan family's disappearance might have been the result of their becoming permanently displaced in time rather than simply vanishing from existence. The late 20th century brought increasingly sophisticated attempts to understand and document the mansion's phenomena, but these efforts also revealed the limitations of conventional scientific approaches when dealing with supernatural or paranormal events. The mansion seemed to exist according to its own rules and logic, rules that didn't conform to the normal laws of physics and reality. Modern investigators documented numerous instances of what appeared to be genuine supernatural activity, including materialization of objects and people, voices speaking in empty rooms, and environmental changes that had no apparent natural cause. But they also discovered that the mansion's phenomena were highly unpredictable and seemed to respond to factors that couldn't be controlled or anticipated. Some researchers theorized that the mansion existed in a state of quantum superposition, simultaneously existing in multiple realities and time periods. According to this theory, the phenomena observed at the mansion were the result of these different realities occasionally intersecting and becoming visible to observers in our timeline. This would explain the temporal displacements experienced by some investigators and the apparent ability of the mansion's invisible residents to interact with the physical world. Others suggested that Cornelius Callahan's experiments had created what could be described as a dimensional rift, a permanent opening between our reality and other planes of existence. The mansion had become a kind of interdimensional crossroads where entities and energies from multiple realities could manifest and interact. This theory would account for the wide variety of phenomena observed at the mansion and the apparent intelligence and intentionality behind many of the supernatural events. During the 1980s and 1990s, advances in computer technology allowed researchers to conduct more sophisticated analyses of the data collected at the mansion. Digital recording equipment captured phenomena that had been missed by earlier analog devices, and computer modeling helped identify patterns in the supernatural activity that had previously gone unnoticed. One of the most significant discoveries of this period was the identification of what researchers termed temporal echoes, recurring patterns of activity that seemed to repeat at regular intervals. These echoes suggested that certain events from the mansion's past were somehow imprinted on the location itself, playing out repeatedly like a recording that had been set on an endless loop. The temporal echoes were most pronounced in the basement chambers, where researchers documented the same sequence of sounds, temperature changes, and electromagnetic fluctuations occurring at precise intervals. Computer analysis revealed that these patterns corresponded to the astronomical alignments that had been present during the winter of 1826-1827, when the Callahan family had disappeared. This discovery led to new theories about the nature of time itself, and the possibility that certain locations could become trapped in temporal loops under specific conditions. Some researchers suggested that the mansion existed in a kind of temporal bubble, isolated from the normal flow of time and doomed to repeat the same period over and over again. As the 21st century began, the Callahan mansion remained one of America's most enduring supernatural mysteries. Despite nearly 2 centuries of investigation and documentation, the true nature of its phenomena continued to elude explanation. The mansion stood as a testament to the limitations of human understanding and the possibility that there were aspects of reality that existed beyond the reach of conventional science and logic. The property continued to attract researchers, paranormal investigators, and curious visitors from around the world, each hoping to experience the mansion's legendary phenomena for themselves or to finally solve the mystery of what had happened to the Callahan family. But the mansion kept its secrets, revealing just enough to maintain interest while withholding the ultimate answers that would explain its enduring mysteries. Local residents had long since accepted the mansion as a permanent part of their community's character, a reminder that their corner of Missouri was home to forces and phenomena that existed beyond normal human experience. The mansion had become a source of both pride and unease, attracting attention and tourism to the region, while also serving as a constant reminder that there were things in the world that couldn't be easily explained or controlled. The legend of the Callahan mansion continues to evolve and grow, with each new generation of investigators and visitors adding their own experiences and theories to the ever-expanding body of lore surrounding the property. The mansion has become more than just a haunted house. It has become a symbol of humanity's ongoing struggle to understand the mysteries of existence and the possibility that reality is far stranger and more complex than we imagine. Recent technological advances have brought new tools to the investigation of the mansion's phenomena, including thermal imaging cameras, digital electromagnetic field detectors, and sophisticated audio analysis software. These modern instruments have documented phenomena that earlier investigators could only describe in subjective terms, providing objective evidence of the mansion's supernatural activity. Thermal imaging has revealed the presence of human-shaped heat signatures moving through the mansion's rooms, even when no living people are present. These thermal anomalies appear to follow the same patterns of movement that would be expected from the mansion's original occupants, suggesting that the Callahan family continues to inhabit their former home in some form. Digital electromagnetic field detectors have identified complex energy patterns that seem to respond to the presence of investigators, growing stronger when questions are asked or when specific areas of the mansion are explored. These patterns suggest that the mansion's phenomena possess some form of intelligence and are capable of responding to external stimuli. Audio analysis software has revealed that the voices captured in the mansion speak in linguistic patterns that are consistent with early 19th century American English, supporting the theory that the phenomena are connected to the original Callahan family. More intriguingly, some of the recorded voices appear to be responding to questions asked by modern investigators, suggesting that communication across time periods may be possible within the mansion's walls. Today, the Callahan mansion stands as it has for nearly 2 centuries, a Gothic monument to ambition, mystery, and the unintended consequences of pushing the boundaries of human knowledge too far. Its windows continue to glow with unexplained lights, its rooms continue to echo with the sounds of invisible occupants, and its basement chambers continue to harbor secrets that may never be fully understood. The mansion serves as a reminder that progress and enlightenment come with risks, that the pursuit of knowledge can lead to discoveries that are too dangerous to control or contain. Cornelius Callahan's quest to understand the fundamental nature of reality had opened doors that perhaps should have remained closed, creating a legacy of mystery and supernatural activity that has persisted for generations. Whether the Callahan family still exists somewhere within the mansion's temporal maze, whether they found a way to transcend physical existence, or whether they simply became victims of forces they couldn't control, remains unknown. But their legacy lives on in the mansion they called home, a place where the boundaries between past and present, between the possible and impossible, continue to blur and shift in ways that challenge our understanding of reality itself. The Callahan mansion stands as a testament to the enduring power of mystery and the human fascination with the unknown. It reminds us that despite all our scientific advances and technological achievements, there are still corners of the world where the impossible becomes possible and where the past refuses to remain buried in history. As long as the mansion stands, the legend of the Callahan family will continue to captivate and terrify those who encounter it. Their story serves as both a warning about the dangers of unchecked ambition and a reminder that reality is far more mysterious and complex than we dare to imagine. In the mist-shrouded hills of Missouri, where time itself seems to bend and twist around a Gothic mansion, the past continues to reach out to the present, ensuring that some mysteries will never be fully solved or forgotten. The mansion's influence extends beyond its physical boundaries, touching the lives of all who encounter its story, and reminding us that the universe contains forces and phenomena that exist beyond our current understanding. In an age of scientific rationalism and technological progress, the Callahan mansion stands as a monument to the enduring mystery of existence itself, a place where the impossible becomes reality, and where the boundaries between different dimensions of existence continue to blur and shift in ways that challenge everything we think we know about the nature of reality.